going. So there's really two reasons. There's two main reasons why Lag BaOmer has become a day which is celebrated across the Jewish community. And the first one is the one that we're going to be discussing mainly tonight. And that is that there was a great sage by the name of Rabbi Akiva, who's very famous for anyone who studied Mishnah or Talmud. The name Rabbi Akiva is from the big ones out there. And Rabbi Akiva was known to have many, many thousands of students. Specifically, at one time, he had an amount of 24,000 students. There was a great plague where most of them died out. And the day that they stopped dying was Lag BaOmer. And because this is the day that they stopped dying, so we recognize that. Like I was learning this with someone yesterday, and they said, "Oh, that's the very Jewish way, focusing on the positive. Instead of, he lost 24,000, but at least they stopped dying." I mean, so the truth to be told, we have all sorts of customs of mourning during this period, from Pesach to Shavuos. For example, we don't hold weddings during this period, and it's for that reason. It's to remember that great loss. But so we do recognize the loss, of course. But the day that they stopped dying was Lag BaOmer, and that was, of course, a great thing that at least that was over. And that's reason number one. And we're going to be talking a bit about that. We're going to see the sources, what the Talmud has to say about that, the reason for that, and so on. That's going to be the main focus. The second event that happened in Lag BaOmer many years later is that one of the disciples of Rabbi Akiva, interestingly enough, one of the few that remained, one of the few that survived, that didn't die with the 24,000, was a man by the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is famous for having authored the Zohar, which is the inner dimension of Torah, basically the source of Kabbalah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, his yahrzeit many years later is on Lag BaOmer. And before he passed away, he actually requested from his students to designate the day that he's going to pass away as a festival for the Jewish people, which is unique because we don't really have sages that have asked that their yahrzeit should be a festival. I mean, usually yahrzeits are more of a solemn occasion. And even though every yahrzeit from a Jewish perspective has an element of joy to it because we celebrate the life of the individual who we're remembering, nevertheless, at the end of the day, most yahrzeits really are a yahrzeit, and they are kind of more of a serious occasion. Whereas with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because he specifically requested that this should be a celebration, and so in his honor, Lag BaOmer is celebrated. And between the interesting thing is that from these two reasons, there's no question that the main noise that's made on Lag BaOmer till today, especially in Israel and even around the world, is really on reason number two more than reason number one. It's known as Lag BaOmer is known as the festival of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It's known as the event celebrating the life of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. That he's the key figure in the whole thing, and that's why there's the concept of, many people have the concept of lighting fires, or we get away with it with a barbecue. But fire is what's the reason? Because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he represented light, taught the inner dimensions of Torah, which is considered the light of Torah. He brought that great teaching of the inner workings of creation out to the fore through the teachings of Kabbalah. And that's also why we celebrate Lag BaOmer outdoors, because the whole idea of Rabbi Shimon was spreading those teachings. Until his generation, they were only taught to a select few, and he went and made it more public. He made it more available, kind of spreading to the outside. So he's well known for this, and his yahrzeit is Lag BaOmer. And mind you, there is a detailed description of his passing, and it's one of the last passages of the Zohar written by one of his students, who detailed the day that Rabbi Shimon passed away and the events that took place in his room next to his bed when he passed away. And when you read that story, and we don't have it in tonight's text, but maybe one day we'll come to that. When you just read the description of what was going on in that room, you realize you are standing in the presence of someone he was in this world, but he was really out of this world. The unbelievable descriptions, the spiritual energy that was going on in that room at the time of his passing was quite unbelievable. Nothing that's recorded by any other tzaddikim. He actually passed away while he was in the middle of giving a teaching, and while he was saying a verse that had the word Chaim in it, which means life. And as he said the word Chaim, he expired. And it was an unbelievable sight for everyone who was there. And his student who was recording it in his diary writes in full detail everything that went on, and how there was a great light in the room, and how on that day Rabbi Shimon was teaching the most amazing explorations of the inner dimensions of Torah that he ever explored in his life. And he spoke about himself very much on that day, and he spoke about his wish to be one with Hashem, and his wish to be one with the Creator, and his And even the words that he used the language that he used, we don't find elsewhere. He said, and the words in Aramaic are b'chad ketiris katarna, which means I'm tied with one knot with my source. I'm bound with an unbelievable bond with Hashem. And that connection to Hashem was very much felt in his presence at the time of his passing. And it's then that he asked that day should be designated as a yontif. And indeed, that's why Lag BaOmer has become known in Israel. Of course, it's unbelievable what goes on Lag BaOmer, and let us hope and pray that everything should be safe in Meron this year on Lag BaOmer. There was a big tragedy there last year, actually, because of all the pushing. But Lag BaOmer is a very, very special day. That's the point. It's because of these two reasons. But like I said, we're going to be discussing mainly reason number one. Although the more well-known one is reason number two, we're going to be discussing reason number one, which is the fact that you had this terrible plague. 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva pass away, but they stopped dying on Lag BaOmer. So we're going to see the sources from the Talmud on this. Before we go into that, let's talk a bit about Rabbi Akiva, who was the man. As soon as you know the context when he lived, who he was, you begin to appreciate just how terrible the tragedy was. Because who was this man, Rabbi Akiva? First of all, as a person, personally, who was he? Rabbi Akiva didn't come from a prominent family. So if someone's big, I have big yichus. My father was special, my grandfather, my great grandfather, Hachi, all the big stuff. Jews like to point to, I come from this one, I come from that one. Rabbi Akiva didn't come from anyone. He was a descendant of converts. He didn't have a very impressive background, and not only that, he was a very simple man. He didn't have a good job, and he wasn't learned at first. He's a descendant of convert, a poor person, very poor. And he got a job at one point in his life. He got a job by one of the wealthiest men in Jerusalem, a man by the name of Kalba Savua. Now, Kalba Savua had a huge flock of sheep and cattle or whatever it was, and Rabbi Akiva was the shepherd for him. And that's how he lived. Now, where does things get interesting? Because Kalba Savua, who was a very prominent fellow and a big scholar, and especially was very wealthy, he had a daughter whose name was Rachel, and his daughter Rachel was hanging out in the fields, and she spotted Rabbi Akiva, and she fell in love with him. And she tells her father, "I want to marry him." You know what her father said? "No way, Jose, not in my lifetime. You're going to marry Rabbi Akiva, the poor shepherd? Never going to happen. We have to marry you to someone prominent, to a big Torah scholar, to someone from a wealthy family at least. I'm not going to have it." And not only that, he told her that if she marries him, he's going to take her out of his will. She will not get a penny from his entire estate. She will not get anything for the wedding. He's going to disown her. But she loved Rabbi Akiva. And she said she's going to go with him. And that's exactly what happened. So the Talmud tells us all this. She goes with, she ends up going, sorry about that. She ends up marrying Rabbi Akiva. And Kalba Savua at that point, he dismisses Rabbi Akiva from his job. What would you like? He dismisses Rabbi Akiva from his job because he was so embarrassed. And Rabbi Akiva and his wife Rachel were now paupers. They had nothing. The Talmud tells us that they slept on the floor. They lived an absolute poor life in the beginning. Now what happened was, before Rachel agreed to marry Rabbi Akiva, she made one condition with him. She said, "I know my father doesn't like this. I know you're a simple man. I know you have no money. I know you're not learned. But one thing do for me. Agree to go and study. Agree to go to yeshiva after we marry, after we have children." She said, "Agree to go study, so at least you should amass some Torah knowledge." And Rabbi Akiva agreed. Rabbi Akiva agreed to that. He went off for a number of years. He left his, and the Talmud tells us also that the Talmud tells us that his studies did not come easy for him as well. It was very difficult for him at first, and he at one point he contemplated leaving the yeshiva because it wasn't really working for him until one day. And the Talmud tells us different stories of how he was teased in yeshiva and he wasn't really doing well. And at one point he made the decision, "I'm leaving. It's not for me. Torah study is not going to work for me. It's just my brain is too thick." And he leaves. And on his way out, he notices an interesting sight. He sees that there is a stone, and there is a leaking pipe or a leaking gutter that's dripping on the stone. And he could see that it's been dripping like that for years and years. And interestingly enough, after years, a there's an indent in the stone. And he notices that and he says, hey, that's unbelievable. A stone is the thickest thing there is out there. But look, something as soft as a drop of water, because it was consistent, because it didn't stop, after years and years and years, it can cause an indent in a stone. And that's a fact. If it keeps going, and keeps going, and keeps going, something will happen. He says, if the water can make an indent in a stone, very slight, so the Torah, which is compared to water, can make an indent in my brain, which may not be as tough as a stone. And he went back to yeshiva, he threw his all into it. And that's when the great turnaround happens. Rabbi Akiva starts doing amazingly well in yeshiva. He becomes, he advances compared to all of his colleagues. He ends up becoming on par with his teachers, ends up becoming greater than his teachers, ends up opening up his own yeshiva and amassing thousands of students. And then he says, it's time to come back home. His wife sent him to learn. He was away for many years. He comes back home, and he has a whole surrounding of thousands of students are following him. It's like a Rebbe who's going with all these big Hasidim. They're running around him and they're giving honor to their teacher. And one woman came out to greet him. You know who the one woman was? His wife Rachel, who was waiting for him, who loved him. And all the students didn't know who she was. And they said, what's going on? A woman coming out over here when we're trying to be with our teacher. Go away from here. You don't belong over here. This isn't respectful. We have the great Rabbi Akiva over here. Who are you doing over here? Rabbi Akiva stopped the entire procession. And he said some of the most famous words to his students. You know what he said? He said, Sheli v'shelachem shelahu. What I have and what you have is all her credit. Don't push her away. That's my wife. And she's actually the one who encouraged me to get involved in learning. And anything that I have and anything that you have, all my Torah knowledge, all my Torah teachings, it's all her credit. Let her in. That's a story. That's the story of Rabbi Akiva. And by the way, then the Talmud tells us, guess what happened to his father-in-law, Kalba Savua? He quickly came back also. and he gave Rabbi Akiva all of his wealth in the end. He was very proud of his ignorant son-in-law at the end. But it took him many years until he was able to come to terms with this. In the end, Kalba Savua was very happy as well. But anyway, that's the story. And that line of Rabbi Akiva is one of the very famous lines that he coined, and you'll have very often, when people want to give a vote of thanks to their wife, and that using Talmudic lingo, they would use that. Shalif v'shalachem shalahu, what's mine and what's yours is all hers. Another famous thing, by the way, just as a side note, that Rabbi Akiva is famous for, there's a song, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. You know who's the one that came up with the words Yerushalayim Shel Zahav? Rabbi Akiva. He bought a golden, I don't know if it was a necklace, it was a golden, I think it was like a head plate for his wife Rachel that said on it Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, and had it was like a design of a golden, something like it. It was called a Yerushalayim Shel. That's what it was a certain golden piece of jewelry that the Talmud says was called Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, and he gave that as a gift to his wife. What would you like? So this is all. I think this is all important. So we realize who we're talking about. It's always good to know the person you're talking about before we get involved. Now let's see what the Talmud has to tell us about the great tragedy that happened when 24,000 of his students passed away. So let me share the screen. Hold on a minute. Let me take Levi upstairs. Okay, so here we go. Okay, do you see my screen? Let's see. The plague. Okay, let's read the first paragraph together with source 1. Tony, would you like to read for us? No, yeah, there we go.
The plague. The Talmud tells us a well-known story. Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students, and they all died during one period between Pesach and Shavuot because they didn't treat each other with respect. And on Log BaOmer, they ceased to die.
Okay, let's see the source. So we already see the reason over here. They didn't treat each other with respect. We're going to be focusing on this. Let's see the source from this. So continue reading. That was from the Rebbe's discussion, which we're going to see. And now let's see the source from the Talmud. This comes from the tractate of Yevamot. Go ahead.
Right, source 1. They said Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students in an area that stretched from Givat to Antipatris in Judea, and they all died in one period of time because they did not treat each other with respect. It is taught all of them died in the period from Pesach to Shavuos. Rav Chachma Bar Abba said, and some say it was Rabbi Chia Bar Avin, they all died a bad death. What is it that is called a bad death? Rav Nachman said, diphtheria.
Okay, so some kind of disease, askara, it's called in the Hebrew. Now, because of this, to remember this great tragedy, we have laws in Shulchan Aruch of how we should behave during this period of time. Judith, would you like to read for us source number 2?
Yes. During 33 days of the Sephirah period, the disciples of Rabbi Akiva perished. Therefore, it is the custom during these days to observe a partial state of mourning. Marriages should not be performed, and one should not take a haircut. There are various customs regarding the day on which to begin to count these 33 days.
Okay, so this is what the Shulchan Aruch says, that we don't have marriages, we don't take haircuts. The various customs, when to begin the 33 days, what's all of that about? Simply because the Talmud only tells us that they died within a time frame. They died sometime between Pesach and Shavuos, for 33 days, but it doesn't exactly say which 33 days. Was it the first 33 days from Pesach until Lag BaOmer? There's another opinion that says that they started dying Rosh Chodesh Iyar until Shavuos, or until 3 days before Shavuos, which will also make 33 days. That's the second opinion. But according to both opinions, they didn't die on Lag BaOmer. Either they stopped dying for good on Lag BaOmer, or according to the second opinion that says that they started dying on Rosh Chodesh Iyar until Shavuos, they stopped for 1 day. On the day of Lag BaOmer, there were no deaths, basically. Because there are two opinions, that's why most communities, till today, they keep the mourning period for the entire period of time between Pesach and Shavuos, although there are communities, I think some of the Sephardi communities don't do it that way. But this is that's the reason for it. So let's try and understand, before asking the big question, which we probably all the obvious question, which is like, what's going on with the Talmud says they didn't respect each other. I mean, what's all of this about? But let's just internalize how deep of a tragedy this was, and why indeed, you ask yourself a question, why? I mean, we're 2,000 years later, why are we mourning now and not taking haircuts? I mean, you're crazy. I'm not taking a haircut now because 2,000 years ago, a group of people died. You have to be crazy, right? The answer is, if you put this in perspective, if you put this in context, historically, when did Rabbi Akiva live? And I didn't mention this earlier when I spoke about his whole story. Rabbi Akiva lived in the time period just after the destruction of the Second Temple. So from a nationalistic perspective, the Jewish people were down the drain. The only thing that was left then was the yeshivas, the Torah study, which the Romans allowed to continue in the beginning, thanks to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, which is a different conversation. And Rabbi Akiva was one of the main teachers then. And in all of the destruction, after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, which was really, really like a Holocaust-like destruction, it was terrible what the Romans did. Rabbi Akiva started rebuilding. He built this big school. He managed to amass all of these students. And then in such a short period of time, 24,000 Torah students died just like that. Within such a short period of time, that was a massive, massive blow to the whole Jewish infrastructure. You have to understand, from a Jewish perspective, Torah learning is everything there is, especially post-temple. Post the temple time, that's all that there was holding the community together. And just like that, it was almost like all of Judaism was destroyed again. This is the greatest minds, the greatest school of the time, all within a few weeks. It was a big thing. And here is where it gets interesting, because the Talmud says, why did they die? They died because they didn't respect. Okay, we know there was a disease. They had this disease. It was a terrible epidemic, fine. But the Talmud gives us this reason: they didn't respect each other. You have to ask yourself, what does that mean? They didn't respect each other. We're talking about great people, right? Not only that, we're going to see it's odd that such people didn't respect each other, because let's see who we're talking about. Veronique, would you like to read for us a question?
Yes, of course. Did they sleep through class? This requires explanation. The master of these very students was Rabbi Akiva, the sage who famously emphasized the great importance of loving one's fellow Jew. The verse states, "And you shall love your fellow as yourself." Rabbi Akiva says this is a fundamental principle of the Torah. It is therefore quite perplexing that specifically his students fail to treat each other with respect, a behavior which does not reflect Ahavat Yisrael, a most integral element of their master's teachings.
Thank you. So that's a good question. I mean, what's going on over here? You're talking about students of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is the champion of the idea that Ahavat Yisrael is a great principle of the Torah. This is the fundamental Zeh Klal Gadol B'Torah in the Hebrew. It's the Torah that says, the verse that says, "V'ahavta l'recha kamocha," you should love your fellow as yourself. But Rabbi Akiva chose this verse from the entire Torah, and he said, this is the main principle of the Torah, the fundamental principle of the Torah. How could it be that his own students failed in such an area and they couldn't respect each other to the extent that they all died because of this? This is their teacher is the man that taught this. So as the headings of, were they sleeping through class? Were they not listening to their own teacher? And not only did Rabbi Akiva preach this, Rabbi Akiva lived this. You know, sometimes you could preach and preach, but you live a different life, so the message doesn't come across. Rabbi Akiva was a man who lived Ahavat Yisrael, and there's a number of stories that the Talmud tells us that really, really demonstrate this. I'll share with you one of them. The Talmud says that there's a story that Rabbi Akiva one time had I don't call it a vision, where he had an encounter with a soul of a deceased individual who gave him a message that he has no rest in the other world. The soul of this deceased individual cannot rest. Why can it not rest? Because no one's saying Kaddish for him. Now, why was no one saying Kaddish for him? Because the whole town where he lived hated him. This was a man who was who wasn't an honest individual. Apparently, he wasn't someone that people got along with. So usually in a community, when someone passes away, if they don't have family, so someone usually says Kaddish for them. But no one wanted to say Kaddish for this individual, and he didn't have any children either. So Rabbi Akiva went and traveled to that town, and he found out that the widow of this individual was actually pregnant with a child. Rabbi Akiva waited for that child to be born, and it was a boy. Rabbi Akiva came back to teach that child how to read, to teach him how to say Kaddish, and told him that years later, that he should be saying Kaddish for his father because the soul of his father is suffering. And the whole community where he went to came to Rabbi Akiva and said, "Do you know who you're dealing with? Do you know who this widow is? This is the widow of such a horrible man. Why do you care about that child?" And Rabbi Akiva said, "Listen, this boy didn't do anything wrong. And at the end of the day, the soul of his father is suffering. And if he says Kaddish, he'll be able to relieve his father's soul." And years later, after teaching after going through all that trouble and going to this place and teaching this boy to say Kaddish, he again this soul appeared to Rabbi Akiva and thanked him and said, "I'm now at rest. I'm now at peace." By the way, this is one of the sources that we have for saying Kaddish until today, this story, that our Kaddish is beneficial for the souls of those who departed. Comes from a story of Rabbi Akiva. What concern? Who would have concern for someone like that? So this is the life of Rabbi Akiva, a man of true love and true care for another individual. And there's many, many stories in the Talmud that demonstrate this. If we have time afterwards, we can share another few stories. So how are we supposed to understand this? So let's see an explanation over here. By the way, before we read this explanation, you know what the easy way out to this question is? Let's not read that for a second. You know what the easy way out to this question is? And you can very easily close down this whole discussion now and say, "Oh, very simple." You're wondering, how could it be that his students didn't accept this teaching of Rabbi Akiva? This easy way out is, you know what happened? It was Rabbi Akiva who saw this event happen to the students, and following that event, he started preaching Ahavat Yisrael to the remaining students. So that would be an easy way out, but that's not the accepted. That's not the truth. The truth is that Rabbi Akiva always preached Ahavat Yisrael, so that would not be a fair answer. So what is the answer? How could it be that his own students didn't accept this? Let's see. True dedication to the cause. Lewis, would you like to help us?
Yes, the explanation is that they failed to treat each other with respect, specifically because they were Rabbi Akiva's students. The explanation: our sages say that no two people think alike. Obviously, this was also true of the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva. Each of them understood the teachings of Rabbi Akiva with their own unique approach and perspective, and each one was convinced that his own conclusion, based on his own individualized approach, was the true meaning of Rabbi Akiva's teachings. Therefore, when one student heard another student interpreting Rabbi Akiva's teachings differently and incorrectly, in his view, he could not possibly treat him with respect or esteem. After all, the colleague was distorting the words of his master. Paying lip service and showing superficial respect was obviously not possible for Rabbi Akiva's students because they were genuine. Their internal capacities were in harmony with their external behavior, and they therefore found it impossible to behave in a way which was not consistent with their true thoughts. Thus, they didn't pay proper respect to their colleagues because they were Rabbi Akiva's students. Every single one of the disciples was dedicated to his master's teachings with all his heart and his soul, to the point that he could not bear the sound of someone misinterpreting his teachings in his own opinion, especially when the misguided student was himself a student of Rabbi Akiva. Obviously, he couldn't possibly respect that individual.
Okay, let's try take that in. Let's try take that in, and we'll see even more of this. What he's beginning to develop an idea, and he's basically saying like this. He's saying these were very great people. Let's say now, by the way, just before we decide that we're sticking up for them, we think this is wrong. By the way, the ultimate is that they made a big mistake. But let's try understand where they were coming from. Where are they coming from? The students of Rabbi Akiva. They're coming from a position that they are absolutely devoted to their teacher. They are a group of people who are true students. We ask, how could students of Rabbi Akiva do this? The answer is precisely because they were so committed to their teacher, and their commitment to their teacher was so strong, and they were very, very opinionated, and each one understood his own teacher's teaching in another way. So guess where that leads me? I'm an unbelievably dedicated student of Rabbi Akiva, and I understand Rabbi Akiva's message is such and such. My colleague is also just as unbelievably dedicated as me. The only problem is that he understands Rabbi Akiva's teachings slightly different. We're going to run into a problem. The problem is going to be hey, I can't respect you. I mean, you're distorting Rabbi Akiva. See, Rabbi Akiva, who I love so much, Rabbi Akiva, who I'm so dedicated to, the great Rabbi Akiva, and you are distorting his teaching? No way, Jose. There's no way in the world that I can come to terms with that. And that was a problem over here. Now, you're going to say, and he said, are you going to say, come on, just because you feel that way, can you not behave another way? No, because they're honest people, and they're not just going to, pay lip service and make as if they're friendly, even though they're not. If you're distorting my teacher's teaching, there's no room for you. I cannot respect you. Finish. There's no room for you at all. How are you going to say, hold on a minute. Didn't Rabbi Akiva preach love of your fellow? What happened to that teaching? And the answer to that is going to be in the next paragraph, which is that it's precisely the opposite. And on the contrary, it's precisely as a result of their love for their fellow that led them to behave like this. You know why? If I didn't love my colleague, then I wouldn't care if he understands Rabbi Akiva's teaching in a different way. But precisely because I love him so much and I want to teach him my way and he's not accepting my way, well, therefore we hit a dead end. But it's a result of my love for him. Because each student of Rabbi Akiva loved their friend so much and wanted their colleague to understand it the way they understood it, as a result of their love for him. You know what the irony of it is? They didn't lack Ahavat Yisrael. They did not lack love of the fellow. You know what they lacked? Respect. We spoke about this in the morning, right? The difference between love and respect. That you can have someone who really, really loves someone, and that love could become toxic. That love is so powerful, it overtakes the person that they love. They forget to respect. They forget that there's boundaries. This, in a way, is exactly what went on over here. Rabbi Akiva students, they were not only, we asked the question, how could it be that students of Rabbi Akiva who preached Ahavat Yisrael, did they not internalize that? The answer is, oh boy, did they internalize it. They internalized it. They were extremists with their Ahavat Yisrael. The problem is, and the Talmud is very precise with its words, it doesn't say that they lacked Ahavat Yisrael. It says they lacked respect. If you look back at the Talmud that we quoted, it said they died because they did not respect one another. Let's read that in the next paragraph, again from the Rebbe, where he says, brings out this point. Moreover, Larry, would you like to read for us?
Thank you. Moreover, they behaved with such conviction, especially because they internalized Rabbi Akiva's foundational teaching, that loving one's fellow is a fundamental teaching of the Torah. Without that instruction, they would not have cared if their colleague misunderstood their master's teachings. But since their teacher, Rabbi Akiva, taught them about the importance of loving their fellow, they were not satisfied with their personal study and mastery of their rabbis' Torah teachings, but instead each attempted to influence their contemporaries, especially their colleagues. Rabbi Akiva students to approach Rabbi Akiva's teachings from the same perspective. When some refrained from accepting their approach, they found it impossible to treat them with respect, especially with the respect that Rabbi Akiva's illustrious students deserved.
So what comes out from this? It's precisely, they didn't lack love of their fellow. They lacked respect. And we have to understand the difference in any relationship. This is true of relationships between spouses, between parents and children, between friends. You can love the other person, but if there's no respect, that love is going to go for failure, and it can become dangerous. It can become toxic. It can become very overpowering, and one partner can become very dominant as a result of his love. I love you so much. I want you to look exactly the way I like, and I want you to dress exactly the way I like, and I want you to behave exactly the way I like because I love you. Right? Well, hold on a minute. Where's your respect? Maybe your partner, your spouse, child, has a different preference. No, but I love you so much. Well, here's exactly the problem. Love that's not based on respect is dangerous. And it's not going to go to good places. And guess what? Here's some relationship advice from our sages 2,000 years ago. Look what Maimonides says. So all the husbands over here, if you don't like this, too bad. Look in source 3. Our sages commanded that a man honor his wife more than his own person and love her as he loves his own person. So you have to love your wife the same way you love yourself, but you have to respect her, honor her. The word in Hebrew, you have to respect her, mechabed, even more than you respect yourself. Why? Because love without respect is no good. Okay, so for all those that like to always quote the sages of the Talmud, is looking down at that. Here, this is a good quote to remind us how the sages of the Talmud what they really thought about relationships. Sorry?
Was this not the fault of Rabbi Akiva himself of having misinterpretation of whatever he was teaching?
He's saying you blame the teacher if his students failed so greatly. Isn't the teacher a bit at fault? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's my reading of it.
So
I mean, things can be interpreted in different ways. So was he not guiding them in a certain way?
Apparently, it's weird to say it, like to put the blame on him. It's interesting because I was learning this with someone yesterday, and they asked me the exact same question. They say, "Hold on a minute, don't we blame Rabbi Akiva then for that?" I don't know. I've never seen that in the analyzation of this whole thing. We never usually lay blame on Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is it's usually considered to be a misunderstanding of Rabbi Akiva's teachings, and the blame is put only on his students, not on him. That said, of course, I mean, at the end of the day, if he would have guided them more, maybe they wouldn't have made this mistake. Who knows? So I certainly understand where you're coming from, and that's a question that the obvious question. Nonetheless, I mean, in the defense of Rabbi Akiva, perhaps you could say why, in the defense of Rabbi Akiva himself, why it was a misunderstanding is that when we look at Rabbi Akiva's own life, we see that he himself did get the right balance.
Right.
And because in the story of his own life and the way he led his own life and the way he treated others with Avat Yisrael, but yet had the correct balance of respect, you can then say, hold on, his students should have picked that up as well.
Right.
And instead, they only picked up half the message. So in the end of the day, Rabbi Akiva is not blamed because the way he himself led his life seems to be the correct way. It's only that his students seem to only pick up, they had selective hearing. So if someone has selective hearing, do you blame the person speaking or do you blame the person with the selective hearing? I don't know. But the question is a good one. So I don't have, but put it this way, the question is better than the answer. So, yeah. The truth is also, there's another whole twist to it. On when we do look at Rabbi Akiva's own life, we see this passion. Rabbi Akiva was a man who had a very, very, very strong passion. He was when you use the word extremist, Rabbi Akiva was a bit of an extremist in his own life. And his students picked up that extremism only in one element. Whereas Rabbi Akiva was extreme across the board, which means he was an extreme in a very good way, but he didn't go dangerous with it. Extremism could go dangerous if it's not guided correctly. And Rabbi Akiva was extreme. he was extreme. For example, he was extreme in his devotion to Hashem. You know, in his wish to, even he himself said the day that he died, and you know how Rabbi Akiva's life ended. He was murdered, tortured by the Romans. They raked his body with iron rakes. And at that time, he said to his students, he said, you know, his students asked him, Rebbe, how are you able to live with this? And you know what he answered them in a very peaceful, calm voice? He said, my whole life, I waited for the moment I should be able to give my life for the sake of Hashem. That's exactly what he said. Now, for someone to say that and believe it, they have to have a very, very, very extreme ideology and a very, very extreme commitment to Hashem. Very, very extreme. Yet, the difference between Rabbi Akiva and his students is, or Rabbi Akiva or anyone else that had anyone else that would experience that, sometimes when a person does go so extreme in their ideas, they kind of lose it and they go haywire and they're not very much present with the people around them because they're so lost in their ideas. And Rabbi Akiva wasn't like that. Rabbi Akiva, until the moment he died, he was very grounded. He was very much aware of his reality. He was very much with the people. He was very much here on earth. So although he had very, very, very strong passion, you know, to be connected to something outside there, to be something greater than himself, and indeed, as he said at the time that he died, nevertheless, in his own life, he didn't live that way. You know, day to day, he was very much aware of what's needed from him at the moment. You know, that right now, I need to be present, and right now, I need to live in an organized fashion. Someone who's extreme usually isn't organized in that way. Rabbi Akiva was. So the point is that it's for this reason that he himself is not usually blamed, because when you look at his own life and the way he conducted his own life, we see a very, very strong balance and a very, very strong sense of I don't know if you call it, you know, being in control of himself in that way. And it's only that his students were selective and they absorbed that one teaching of him, which is, this is the unbelievable principle of the Torah, and they dropped the need to respect. So I think that helps us understand that in context, and why I don't believe you'll ever find any of the traditional teachings that cast blame on Rabbi Akiva in any way. Rabbi Akiva is always looked at as like the great of the great, even when we're talking about the failings of 24,000 students. So here we see, this is what we see, that love they had. They were committed students of Rabbi Akiva, and they even absorbed this teaching of Rabbi Akiva, which tells us that you need to, which tells us that you need to love your fellow as yourself. The problem is they were lacking respect, and when a person has love without respect, they have no problem. They have a big problem. Another very, very, if you're looking for a very day-to-day example of such a thing, how sometimes it's only when you love someone that you care about them. If you put it on the context like this, the students of Rabbi Akiva, who is it that they couldn't respect? They didn't respect. Who is it that they were not respecting? Only their own colleagues. Someone on the street, chances are that they respected them. Why is it that their own colleagues from all people they couldn't respect? You know why? Because they loved their own colleagues. See, they felt a connection to their own colleagues. Oh. He really does want to give the shiur, you see? But he has a different way of giving it. Yeah. So this is the thing. The reason why they had this issue, the reason why they ran into the issue over here is precisely because they were close to them, because they felt a care for them, because they loved them, and they wanted that they should be part of their same worldview. Someone who was just on the street, someone who they didn't know, it wouldn't bother them. So here you see that precisely because they internalized this teaching of the teacher to love your fellow as yourself, to love your colleague as yourself, they really did. And look what happened. Why? Because they were missing respect. So this is the explanation in the Rebbe's view. And this is elaborated on in many different places, and you can look at it from many different angles. But this is the gist of the Rebbe's explanation into what went wrong over here. Basically, in one word, they had a lot of love, they were lacking respect, and this is a big problem. But now let's see, there's another question. However, the story requires explanation. Did everyone read? Eleanor, would you like to read for us?
Okay. The Rebbe, however, this story, sorry, that one? Yeah?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So here's the story requiring explanation. 1, the death penalty. Really? This lack of respect was obviously unbecoming for the students of Rabbi Akiva. The differences of opinion shouldn't have influenced their treatment of one another, and they should have given space for others to express different opinions. Their behavior, to the contrary, was inappropriate, especially in light of the spiritual standing they had as students of Rabbi Akiva. Nonetheless, I lost my place.
Right, 3 lines before the end, nonetheless.
Why were they penalized so severely for that sin alone, to the extent that they all died? Well, this question's accentuated in light of our explanation of the matter, that they didn't actually belittle each other, and it wasn't a lack in their love for one another, as per their master's teaching. It was simply a lack of true deference.
So good question. I think we all had this question when you read this. When you read the story, I mean, come on, yeah, they should have been more respectful. I mean, they should all die because of that. You must say there was obviously something else going on over there, right? It wasn't just this. Now, by the way, and we know there was an epidemic, there was a disease going around over there, so there was something else also. But what else is there something else also? It cannot just be that they were, just because they didn't respect one another. Even from a spiritual perspective, there's something else going on. So that's one question. You know, how could it be that just for this alone they would be punished in this way? And now there's another question, which is like a simple question when you look at the whole story and its details. And where are we up to? Janet or Rosalind, if you'd like to read, then we need to see you. But I don't know if you want to read. So Tony, if you come back, unless we have any other.
Yeah, I don't mind reading.
Oh, there you go.
As long as I can see it, because I'm reading off a phone. So you'll need to move the thing up. Okay?
Yeah, is it good now?
They all sinned at once. It is also obvious that all these disciples, the enormous amount of 24,000, did not all become students in a single day. I can't see the next bit. It was a process
of many years.
It was a process of many years. When Rabbi Akiva began teaching his students and the fame of his personality and his teachings began to spread, students were slowly attracted to him. And with time, the numbers grew exponentially until they reached 24,000. It is likewise obvious that the behavior of the disciples didn't suddenly in one single moment become disrespectful. It was more likely a gradual process. This is very surprising. Why were they all punished in a single time period? It's difficult to imagine that in such a short period of time, between Pesach and Shavuot, all 24,000 students were suddenly deserving of punishment and the death penalty, no less. There must have been something out of the ordinary that took place for the time, which was the cause of their death.
Okay, we all agree with that. It's something else. And so there's 2 questions over here, basically. Number one, the question was, come on, just because they didn't respect each other, that doesn't seem to be a reason for this. And number 2, it doesn't make sense. Such a huge amount of people, which logically came in different times, all of a sudden, within 3 weeks, or all of a sudden not respect each other. Something else must have happened right then at that time that would have caused this. So here we have an original answer, which we may not like, but this is an answer. Let's see. And we're going to see it's compared based on a different story that the Talmud tells us. We may have an insight into this. And now let's go back. Tony, if you would like to read for us.
Sure. The evil eye. This question can be resolved based on another Talmudic story in which similar terminology is used. They all died in a single time period. Okay,
so what the Rebbe is going to suggest over here is that because we're looking for another factor that would have perhaps brought about this terrible tragedy, we find another story in the Talmud that also talks about a lot of people dying. And the Talmud uses the exact same terminology. They all died in a single time period, that exact same terminology regarding a different story. And if we look at what was going on in that story, perhaps we could glean insight and say, aha, maybe something similar happened here, and then we can understand perhaps what would have been a factor in causing this great death. So what is that story? So if you continue reading over here, this is the story that the Rebbe is referring to. And let's read it, and then I'll explain everything that's going on in this story. This comes from the Jerusalem Talmud.
Right, Jerusalem Talmud, Sanhedrin. It happened that 24 carriages of people appointed by the house of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the leader of the Jewish people, entered to extend the year at Lod. For this decision was supposed to take place in Judea, the seat of the high court. After the temple's destruction, most sages lived in Galilee. So Rabbi Yehuda sent carriages to transport them to Lod in Judea.
Yeah, I'll stop there just for a minute so I can explain what's going on over here. What we're talking about, going from Galilee to Lod in order to extend the year. This is called, by the way, this year, for example, in the Jewish calendar, is called a leap year, Shnata Ibur. Now, in the times of when there was a Sanhedrin, in order to, they didn't have a calendar printed like today, but every year it would be determined based on the year, based on the previous few years, should it be a leap year or not? With all the different determinations, it doesn't really make a difference now. But what's relevant over here is, number one, where would this take place? So as long as the temple stood, it would take place in Jerusalem. Following the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, in order to remember, even though the vast majority of sages moved up north to the Galil, nevertheless, for this event, they would go back to Judea to pronounce the leap year there in order to remember the way it was always done. Now, so Rabbi Yehuda would send carriages of his students. Why would he send carriages? Because it wasn't just that the Beis Din would sit there and they would determine it. They would make a whole event out of this. It was like a whole celebration. And the Mishnah describes it was a massive party, a massive event where they would announce that it's a year, there's going to be a leap year, and it was a whole celebration. All the sages would come. So the story that this Jerusalem Talmud is saying is that there was one time that Rabbi Yehuda sent 24. Does that number sound familiar? In our story, we also have 24,000. Keep that in mind. 24 carriages of great sages to Jerusalem, not to Jerusalem, to Judea for this, to Lud, for this special event. Now continue the story. What happened? And the evil eye.
And the evil eye entered with them from locals who were offended that they weren't considered scholarly enough to declare a leap year, and they all died in the same time period. From that time on, they removed the location of the leap year deliberations from Judea and established it in Galilee. They also wanted to remove the location of the new month deliberations. Rabbi Shimon told them, "We do not even want to leave a remembrance of the fact that the high court was once situated in Judea."
Yeah, he said that as a question. Do we not even want to leave a remembrance? Meaning he said that a little bit we should leave there. Okay, so what's going on over here? What's important over here? He says he sent these 24 carriages. They all died. Why did they all die? In this way, the key line is they all died in the same period. It's the exact same way the Talmud describes it happened to the students of Rabbi Akiva. But why? Over here, the Talmud gives a reason. The evil eye. What's the evil eye according to Judaism? We don't believe that there's like these hocus pocus powers that can just affect things. But but the Talmud does talk about the evil eye. What is it basically? The evil eye basically means when a lot of focus is given to someone's blessings in life. Let's say, for example, so let's say if someone sees that I have this, that, and the other, and I'm doing very, very well, and then they go and talk to their friend and they say, I saw how amazing, he has such amazing things, he has such wonderful family, he has such wonderful assets, he has such wonderful this. Is it really right? Does he really deserve it? So let's say, so two people talk about someone else. What happens at that moment? What happens at that moment is they create the evil eye. What does it mean the evil eye? Do they create like a being in the heaven that's going to destroy them? No. What they do is at that moment, when the heavenly court hear that someone is being questioned, you know what the heavenly court says? Let's open up the books. Let's check. Now, guess what? When the Charities Commission does an investigation, no one is happy. Even if everything is good, you don't want anyone poking around, right? When the IRS starts poking around, no one is happy. Even if everyone is behaving. Why? Because there'll always be something that maybe you didn't want anyone to see. Oh, it's the exact same thing. That's really what evil eye means. What evil eye means is that when something is brought up, when the blessings of someone else is brought up in a negative way. So when someone looks down at someone else for the blessings that they have, and they say to themselves, does that person really deserve that? You know what Hashem says? Hashem says, let's check. Let's open up their books. Guess what? When the books are open, no one really wants the books to be open, because when the books are open, there'll always be an issue over there. Now, that's in short what ayin hara is. And that's why in Yiddish, for example, you ever heard, I'm sure you heard people say k'nai hara. You heard from your parents and your grandparents in Yiddish, they always used to say k'nai hara, k'nai hara. What does k'nai hara mean? It's Yiddish for kain ayin hara. May there not be an evil eye. And what that usually means is when a person does talk about, something nice, so let's say in Yiddish, how many children do you have? Say, I have 4 children, k'nai hara. You right away say that, this should not be, they should not open up any. I don't want any trouble, from mentioning this. From mentioning these blessings. But this is a Jewish concept, by the way. But again, it doesn't mean that there's some other kind of external force that's able to impose things on you. What it does mean is that once attention is being given, once negative attention is being given to you for your blessings, then the heavenly court, Hashem himself, decides, let's make an investigation, see if you actually deserve those blessings or not. In this case, so coming back over here, because the locals were jealous, they said they were offended. They said, all these people, they're coming from the Galilee. We're not good enough to announce the leap year. You have to come from the Galilee. You're greater scholars than us. Who are you? Do you really think you're better than us? That affected the evil eye, and as a result of that, all of these carriages of people, it was a disaster. It was very tragic. That's a story that the Talmud says. Now, again, it's a strange concept, this whole thing with the evil eye. I get that. But this is a story of the Talmud, and Judaism does talk about this and believe in this. The Talmud is full of this kind of these things. Let's now apply that to what happened over here, and we'll see how there could be a similar thing over here. Let's see. So where are we up to? Judith, would you like to read for us?
Yes. The story clearly states why they died. They had gathered in large numbers and had thereby attracted the evil eye. Perhaps this sheds light on our story, which uses the exact same terminology. They all died in the same time period. Rabbi Akiva's students died in one time period because at that time their number reached 24,000, an immense number of students. Moreover, Kabbalah explains that 24 is associated with the divine attribute of judgment. And this is evident from the Jerusalem Talmud story as well, that attracted the evil eye, causing their death. This doesn't contradict the Talmud's explanation that they died because they didn't treat each other with respect. The two reasons converged. A failure to accord proper respect isn't a severe enough sin to warrant capital punishment, as we explained earlier. But once the evil eye was attracted to them during that period of time, they were punished also for the minor sin of not treating one another with respect. Perhaps this reflects the idea stated in the Talmud that during turbulent times, God gives retribution even for a failure to pursue the mitzvah of tzitzit, even though it is not technically an obligation, and so on.
Okay, let's just try to understand this for a moment, what's going on over here. So he says over here is like this. This story of the Talmud seems to have, from the Jerusalem Talmud, seems to have quite a few parallels to the story of the students of Rabbi Akiva, and perhaps we can glean some insight from there to here. First of all, we see the number 24, which we know, according to Kabbalah, isn't a lucky number. Fine. So 24 is an unlucky number. But besides that, and more down to earth, we see a few similar ideas that took place. Number one, there were many students, a large group of people, attracting attention in one place at the same time. The story of the Jerusalem Talmud has that. The story of Rabbi Akiva students also is a large group of people as well, which caused a very impressive, Rabbi Akiva coming with this impressive group of 24,000 students. What do you think that caused people to say? That caused people to say, oh, really? I know, but they're so special, they're so big, they're so this, they're so that. So the investigation gets opened. And just like in the story with of the Jerusalem Talmud, that is exactly what ends up happening over here as well, that you have the evil eye was brought upon them. How are you going to say what the Talmud says about the students of Rabbi Akiva that they didn't respect one another? It doesn't say anything about the evil eye. So the Rebbe suggests over here, perhaps both are true. And it's only because you have the combination of both that actually helps us, at least in a slight way, understand why it was so severe. Because indeed, one without the other wouldn't have done it. And perhaps in contemporary terms, COVID is terrible. But if someone only has COVID, hopefully they could survive. But if you have COVID plus strong case of diabetes, plus this, plus that, plus cancer, you're in gahak tzaras, right? So if you have the evil eye, plus you don't have respect for one another, then you don't want to be there. Then it might not end well. And that's, I think, what he's saying over here. He said they had this issue. Yeah, it's true. They had this issue with not respecting one another. Would that itself be enough, to cause this punishment? No. But when they had the evil eye, and the evil eye causes that the books get opened, there's an investigation. Oh, when you have that, and then we find, and you have this, and you have that, then you're already things are no good. It's in addition, let me say, which is explained. It's explained elsewhere, because still it's very difficult to come on. They deserve this just for this. It's still very difficult to really internalize this. I've seen it explained elsewhere, and this perhaps does help understand that we have a concept in Judaism that there is stricter judgment for those who are on a higher level. Precisely, in other words, that for simple people, this would not be applied to them. So for simple people, why? Because simple people are not expected to have such high standards. But specifically when you're dealing with people who are considered to be on a high level, have very high standards, so even a minor violation is considered major. Why? Because there's someone who's on such a high level. An example for this is, by the way, I think a more down-to-earth example is, we know there's a mitzvah, we read it in last week's Torah portion, the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem and not making Chilul Hashem, which means we have to always behave. A Jew is always commanded, every person needs to behave like a mensch, right? But a Jew has an extra special mitzvah in the Torah to behave in a way that makes other people say, that's the way one should behave. A Jew behaves in a correct way. And if they don't, it's considered a biblical prohibition of making a Chilul Hashem. You have desecrated, not your own name, you have desecrated Hashem's name. You know why? Because anytime someone sees a Jew, they don't just say, oh, he's a private individual. They say, oh, he's Jewish. They say, oh, he represents God. He represents the Jewish people. So you're making a bad name for the entire Jewish people and for Hashem, who chose the Jewish people. Now, in the laws of Chilul Hashem, Maimonides says something fascinating. He says that a rabbi has a different level of biblical prohibition and has to take extra concern more than a layman. Why? The mitzvah is the same. The Torah says you shouldn't make Chilul Hashem. You know why? He says like this. He says, because a regular person, when people look at him, they may excuse him. They may say, okay, fine. He doesn't know. He's not expected to know. He's just, he's not as learned. But the rabbi, the guy who's in a position, he has to be all the more careful. He has to be, and if he behaves even, if he does something that could be acceptable for someone else, but someone who's in a position of leadership, unacceptable for you. So we see basically over here, I think that's a good example where we see that sometimes a minor failure, which for a regular person could just be overlooked, but for someone who's on a greater level, so if you're on a greater level, you automatically have greater accountability. Perhaps that helps.
A question. Would you like me to keep it till later?
Yeah, well, we're going to take questions in a minute. So we're going to finish reading everything, and then we're going to take the questions. Okay. So just to tie this all together, in this case, so the question that we asked over here was, the first half of the lesson we understood very clear. We had an explanation as to what was really going on. We explained that they had a lot of love, but they were lacking respect. We understood that. We then asked, how could it be that they still, why would they get the death penalty? And does it really make sense that all of this happened at one time? Remember that question? Got to be like all of. And the answer now, based on this answer, we actually do understand that it's only specifically when they all reached that number, when they were such a great number all together, then there was the evil eye, because the evil eye only comes when there's a lot of attention, because it comes as a result of people paying attention to something which calls for a lot of attention. So when there is a big noise, when there's a big 24,000 students, when it comes to that level, and then the cases get opened, and then the files are opened, and then we see, oh, they're also not respecting one another. That together with that caused this great tragedy. What's the lesson? What's at the end of the day, we read this and it doesn't have a very nice ending, but yet the Talmud tells us this, and every year in Lag BaOmer we remind ourselves of this. You know why I remind ourselves? Let's see the next paragraph, the lesson. So let's read. Lewis, are we up to you again? Would you like to read?
Yes. Yes. The lesson. This story about Rabbi Akiva's disciples, that they died because they did not respect each other, is included in the Torah, and the words and the word Torah means instruction. Therefore, despite the fact that this is a story told about the great disciples of Rabbi Akiva, and they were treated so severely precisely because of their greatness, nonetheless, the story is cited and studied in the Torah to teach us that every Jew must strive for the ultimate form of loving your fellow, even in cases where there might be good reason to avoid showing full respect to your fellow.
Okay, and that's obviously that's obviously a tall order. So the lesson that we have is a simple one, that basically we're not expected necessarily to to invite everyone in for lunch. We're not expected to be everyone's best friend, but we are expected at least to have respect. We have to have respect for each other. The lesson that we learn from Rabbi Akiva students is, of course, we have to have Abat Yisrael. We have to have love of our fellow as ourselves. But even more important than loving your fellow, and loving someone else could be very difficult at times. But at the very least, we should have that respect, which basically tells us that even if we're different, and we're always going to be different, and because by nature, people are different. God made us that we're different, and I think one way and you think another way. The question is, are we going to be like Rabbi Akiva's students, and we're going to say, everyone has to be the same? You say, oftentimes people feel like unity means everyone has to do the same thing. That's not what unity means. Unity doesn't mean conformity. Unity means that even though we're different, we can still respect each other. Unity means we can still say hello to each other, even if we're different than each other. That's what unity means. And that's perhaps what Rabbi Akiva, that's a lesson we learned from the failing of Rabbi Akiva students, but really it's an imperative for us to get it right, which is that even if we're not going to be the same, we can still be friends. We can still respect someone else who's going to be different than us and who will remain different than us. But we don't have to make everyone the same as us. We can be different, yet we can be civil, we can be respectful. And that's really such an important lesson of Lag BaOmer. And that also comes back to the second hero of Lag BaOmer, which I started out with, which is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who also championed this idea. And we see from his lifestyle how he was always going out of his way to do kindness to other people. There's a story that the Talmud says that, after we know this famous story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he was hiding from the Romans for 13 years in a cave. And you would think after he came out of that cave, you would think that he would, want to take some time to get his life together. Instead, he made it a mission to go and be helpful, to try to see what could be repaired, to see if there's anything that he could do to help society around him. He really absorbed the true teaching of Rabbi Akiva, perhaps which is why he was one of the 5 that survived. So that's really the lesson of, one of the amazing lessons, of Lag BaOmer. So with that, when we come to Lag BaOmer, we can actually, celebrate it and internalize the idea. I look forward to seeing you all, of course, by the Lag BaOmer barbecue on Thursday, which is to be this week. Judith, you had a question?
Yes, Rabbi, thank you very much. There's something that is still confusing me slightly.